What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review The New Mutants from director Josh Boone. It opened up today, and I had to take a train all the way to Connecticut in order to see it in the theater because, for whatever reason, this movie is not coming out on premium VOD. It has something to do with the original deal when Disney acquired Fox. In any event, for me, it was totally worth it, both to take the train an hour each way, as well as to catch a movie during the season of the virus, because these characters were a massive part of my childhood. I've been looking forward to this movie for a very long time, and I needed to see for myself what they got right, what they got wrong, what works, what doesn't. The theater was nearly empty, and if you buy a seat right now, they basically block out all the seats around you, so you basically have like a little cocoon of protection. Who knows when we'll see the full theatrical model back up and running again at the level that it was back in 2019, one of the biggest years of box office in movie history. But as a lifelong movie junkie, it is nice having big budget Hollywood movies back in my life. But I recognize that everybody's comfort level with going to the movies is going to be very different, so I'm going to keep the first half of this video totally, completely spoiler-free because I know a lot of people are just going to have to wait until it's available on video on demand. So not to worry, I'll keep my comments incredibly broad initially. And it's going to be tough for me to review this movie in an objective fashion because I grew up on these characters. Back in the 1980s, Chris Claremont was writing both The New Mutants as well as Uncanny X-Men, and he was hitting home runs on a pretty regular basis. And my older brother and I were collecting as many of those comics as we possibly could. I think the very first comic book subscription by mail that we ever had was for Uncanny X-Men. And I remember it came in these strange little like paper sleeves, and the comic could very easily slide in and out of them. In any case, my first encounter with The New Mutants was way back in Uncanny X-Men number 167, when the X-Men were coming back from this horrific, awful, terrifying war with the Brood, and they found all these fresh-faced youths living in their home, seemingly uninvited, and naturally, because we're talking about superheroes, a giant brawl broke out, and it took them a little while to realize that Professor X was actually infected with the Brood Queen, that they needed to team up in order to save the Professor. In any case, from that point on, I was hooked on the characters. But the reason I mention all this, I don't know how people are going to react to this movie if they don't have that level of emotional attachment to these characters, because I really like the lineup that they chose. Some purists are going to push back on the fact that Karma, who was one of the original members, did not make the cut. I'm a big fan of Magma and Warlock and Cypher and all those early characters from the New Mutants. But if you were a reader back in the 1980s, you're going to experience this movie in a completely different way. And I think from that perspective, this movie gave me serious chills during the scenes that worked. And during the scenes that did not work at all, I basically just kind of rolled my eyes and tried to ignore the parts of the movie that weren't working as well. But as much as I felt complete and total unbridled joy at a few scenes during this movie, I can't really claim it's a great movie. Maybe I can't even really claim that it's a good movie. However, it is a movie that I really thoroughly enjoyed, and I'll definitely be watching again. When I finally get a chance to watch it at home, I'll probably just fast forward through the parts that I think suck. But the good news is, for people who've been following the X-Men over at Fox from the summer 2000 with the first Bryan Singer movie up through the present day, I mean, it's 20 years of movie making at this point. It's incredible. It brings to a close the Fox era and their handling of the X-Men library of characters before the inevitable reboot, now that all this characters have been sold over to Disney to become part of the MCU. Because to be totally blunt, last summer's Dark Phoenix, I thought it completely, totally sucked balls. It was an absolutely atrocious movie. So at a bare minimum, at least this franchise is ending on a relative high note, or at least a relative high note in comparison to the loathsome movie known as Dark Phoenix. And I think this movie has a really solid premise. We have 5 the classic New Mutant characters who are trapped in this hospital/prison, and they've been brought there presumably so that they learn how to control their powers, so that they no longer pose a threat to society or to themselves. But with the arrival of the latest mutant, Danny Moonstar, suddenly this hospital/prison starts to resemble this absolute chamber of horrors. And I think the movie's at its best for like the first half, because as the characters are getting to know one another, the chemistry is incredible because they're basically late teens, early 20-somethings, and they're indulging in all sorts of like teasing and bonding and laughing and flirting and ritualistic hazing. And most of the cast did an absolutely phenomenal job during these scenes. And I also appreciated the fact that this movie at least tried to draw upon the classic Demon Bear storyline that was illustrated by the great Bill Sienkiewicz. Now, when I was a little kid, Bill Sienkiewicz, I loved his stuff when he was on Moon Knight, but when he transitioned to New Mutants, suddenly his art just took like 10 evolutionary leaps forward, and it became so abstract and horrifying and terrifying and basically just so punk rock that for my young eyes, it kind of freaked me out and I couldn't really process it. I think if I'd been just a couple of years older, I would have embraced it much more. But now as an adult, those issues drawn by Bill Sienkiewicz are some of my all-time favorite comics published at Marvel during the 1980s. But if I was going to try to pitch this movie to people who are the part of the unconverted, who don't give a damn about Marvel Comics or Chris Claremont or the New Mutants, it's basically Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, because you've got a hospital, you've got all these young people who are haunted and tormented by all kinds of nightmares. The nightmares in this movie come about for a very different reason, But basically, they all have to learn to tap into and control the various gifts and learn to work together as a team if they're going to survive the experience. And I think it actually would make a really good double feature with Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. And I think for casual fans of the superhero genre, basically people who watch the occasional movie or the occasional show but don't feel compelled to watch each and every new superhero movie. But I think it was an interesting experiment in seeing just how well the horror genre and the superhero genre work when they're thrown together. I think the superhero genre is perpetually at risk of becoming really repetitive and stagnant and derivative. And when you combine it with new genres, it just opens up so many new doors. Like perfect examples back in 2014 in the MCU, when you had Captain America, the Winter Soldier, kind of veering into the world of political thriller, and you had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 veering into the world of cosmic space opera. And they were both incredible injections into the overall kind of MCU flavor and tapestry. So my hope is that people will take a page from this movie's book and combine horror and superheroes more frequently moving into the future. But in spite of all the geeky thrills that this movie had to offer for me, I have to be honest, and there's a lot about this movie that doesn't work. There's some giant plot holes that you could drive a truck through that are incredibly frustrating. And in my opinion, the final third, as it leads to this giant climactic battle, that's when the movie completely just disintegrates and falls to pieces. You get some really murky, clumsy CGI that's just not very convincing at all. It just becomes a CGI fest, and I have no problem with CGI whatsoever, but when it no longer looks like the characters you've been following or even a part of the story, and everybody's kind of moving kind of awkwardly, and the laws of physics just no longer seem to apply, I have to admit, the big, giant, show-stopping battle at the end for me was a colossal disappointment. But that's as far as I can go without dipping into some spoilers, so this is my last spoiler warning. But I think what I'm going to do for the rest of the review is just break up all my comments to the stuff that I loved and the stuff that I hated, because there's a fair amount on both fronts. But I think the greatest strength of this movie is its cast. They absolutely hired the best possible actors to play all these parts. Anya Taylor-Joy is lethal and sexy as Magik. Macy Williams is incredibly kind and adorable as Wolfsbane. Charlie Heaton's a lovable shit kicker as Cannonball. And all the bonding and hazing and flirting and bullying they do, just that sense of camaraderie as an ensemble cast really worked. And I thought Alice Braga did a really good job as the antagonist of the film, as Dr. Reyes, who's basically their doctor slash jailer, who's observing them and studying them and punishing them anytime they step out of line. And there are moments where these characters absolutely look and feel like they do straight out of the comics. And moments like when Wolfsbane is in her transitional form, she's not quite human, she's not quite a wolf, she's more of like a humanoid werewolf. And she has one really satisfying scene where she completely, totally cuts loose with her teeth and claws, just tearing Dr. Reyes to pieces. It's fucking awesome. But the real highlight of this movie, and it's been obvious for like 2 years now what it was going to be, is seeing Anya Taylor-Joy cut loose as Magik. When she demons out and armors up her arm and puts her sword to use and her eyes start blazing with all this demonic energy, it's glorious stuff. And when she finally started cutting loose and taking people down, you could hear the audience really getting into it. The problem is that the character of Iliana Rasputin has one of the best character arcs of any comic book character of the 1980s, from the time that she's an innocent little girl to the time that she spends in limbo, where she picks up all of her new sorceress abilities, and then to her inevitable transformation during this incredible company-wide crossover Inferno. She had by far one of the most interesting character arcs of any character ever cooked up by Chris Claremont. And this movie basically has to condense and simplify and compress everything. And in terms of the depth of the character, she kind of gets the shaft. You really would need 2 or 3 movies or 2 or 3 seasons of a show to flesh out her full character arc. So in spite of the fact that the movie never even bothered really to dive into the details of what her mutant powers are versus her sorceress powers that she picked up in Limbo, which are 2 separate things, when she's in action, it absolutely works. So when I'm watching it, I'll just have to pretend as if I saw a different movie that actually did a good job of building up her origin story, and then just appreciate the moments where she truly cuts loose. But what makes her character so much fun is that she's the one character who loves using her powers. She enjoys killing people. She loves the fact that she's beautiful. She loves the fact that men look at her. She loves teasing them and making them pursue her. Most teenagers, when they're first discovering their powers, they're afraid of hurting themselves or someone they love. Iliana's the exact opposite. She is like an apex predator, and she completely steals the show in each and every single scene where she appears. She's definitely one of the best bullies I've seen in movies in quite some time. And watching the way the characters react to her gives us some of the best comedy. Like at one point, Sunspot's watching her in action, and he's so turned on. He's like, I'm going to marry that girl. I mean, the effect that she's having on him is the effect that she's having on the entire audience. And in terms of the peak of the story, it has to be the scene that they teased a couple weeks ago, where the demon bear is attacking this facility. Everybody's terrified. Nobody knows what to do. And Magik basically decides that she's going to take on this giant demon bear single-handed. And it's just one of those great kick-ass, badass superhero moments that superhero fans live for. And for the true diehard X-Men nerds out there, there's some great Easter eggs out there. We actually get to see Lockheed in this movie, and for anybody who likes Kitty Pryde or Iliana Rasputin, you're obviously a fan of Lockheed. And I guess the one bittersweet part about this movie being the end of the 20-year run over at Fox is that, as it turns out, the characters, they're not at this hospital being groomed to possibly one day go join the X-Men. They're being groomed basically to become like lab rats / weapons for a company called Essex. And if you know your X-Men history, you know who Mr. Sinister is, and you know that Mr. Sinister started his life as Dr. Nathaniel Essex. So who knows, maybe this movie will do well enough where it makes enough money where perhaps it will get a sequel where they encounter Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister is one of the coolest villains that was ever created in any era in Marvel Comics. And the way this movie is designed, it's incredibly self-contained. So even if Marvel decided to completely, totally reboot the entire X-Men continuity over for the MCU, they actually could kind of preserve this like in a little capsule and just bring it on over. But that's up for the powers that be at Marvel to decide. Now, in terms of the bad, this movie fell into a trap that I've suspected it probably would, because we already saw this happen once in X-Men Days of Future Past. But so many writers and filmmakers seem to get confused by the fact that Sunspot is not the Human Torch. Admittedly, after years and years and years, he learned how to use his powers in different ways, where he could do like concussive blasts and that sort of thing. But initially in the comic, Sunspot's power is the ability to absorb solar energy and then convert it into strength and endurance. He's basically about as strong as your average Sherman tank. And yet this movie falls into the trap where, as part of his origin story, he accidentally burned a girl up. He's always worried about heating up too much. And when he uses his powers, it burns his clothes off. In the comics, when Sunspot uses his powers, he just gets imbued with this dark energy. If he's dressed in regular clothes, then those clothes get imbued with the same energy. And it's just so incredibly frustrating. Where such a simple power set, he absorbs solar energy and he becomes strong. Stop trying to turn him into something that he's not. And furthermore, his character totally gets the shaft when it comes to fleshing out his origin story, and he also gets screwed in terms of total screen time. So I wish Sunspot had been handled better by this movie, but the sad reality, he was not. It was just a giant missed opportunity. Another frustration for me is that we never really get to see Cannonball blast off properly. At one point, we see him practicing with his powers, and we see the aftermath at times after he charges through things, but there's never a point in the final battle when they're fighting the Demon Bear where we actually just get to see him take off in the way that we all know and love and just go blasting straight into the bad guy. It would have been such a simple shot to do. So while I love the way they characterize him during his quiet moments, during his character beats, the way they depicted his powers I found to be very frustrating. And as I mentioned before, the climax is particularly bad, and that's because the Demon Bear just looks terrible. As drawn by Bill Sienkiewicz, it's just like something that springs forth right from your nightmares. It's totally metal. It's just evil incarnate and a perfect godlike entity that just mopped the floor with the New Mutants for quite some time before they finally found a way to outmaneuver it. And it just becomes this big, giant, clumsy, murky CGI mess. And I could just feel my enthusiasm running out of me like the air escaping from a balloon. And the movie also does a really poor job of explaining how these characters are trapped there. These characters are powerful as hell, and when they work together, they're incredibly formidable. And they've got one mutant there keeping them in their cages. Dr. Reyes has the ability to create force fields, but there are plenty of scenes where she's locking her patients in rooms, and it's like, you know what? Push back. She's just a person. At one point, we see her slamming Iliana into solitary confinement, and if there's one mutant who can escape from anything, it's her. She can teleport. She can teleport wherever the hell she wants. It doesn't matter if you have force fields around her. She can just step right through them. They should have found a better way to explain how the Doctor's able to push her around and lock her up in solitary confinement. And for a movie that had all the time in the world for reshoots and rewrites, etc., it was just frustrating that the movie still had so many plot holes this late in the game. In any case, I'd still like to see another movie featuring these actors. They've all aged quite a bit since they made this movie. I think they shot it back in like 2016 or 17, and obviously just had so many fits and starts when it came to the eventual release date. But I'm glad we finally got a chance to see it. I do think it will develop a little cult following. I think it shows these characters largely in a positive light, and it shows the power of horror and superheroes thrown together. So, like I said before, I enjoyed the movie. I just have to acknowledge that it has plenty of flaws that are holding it back from reaching its full potential. But that's all I got to say for now. So hope you enjoyed this review. Hope you enjoyed checking out whenever you get a chance to do so. If, like me, you're one of those people that flies into a murderous rage anytime someone turns on one of their devices in a movie theater, right now is actually a pretty good time to go because the theaters are largely empty. You got the theater to yourself. But if you want to talk more about X-Men or New Mutants or Marvel or whatever, you can always hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax. But please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.